Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Manning. I'm the CEO and founder of DealVector. And today we have Deborah Dermody talking to us about antitrust compliance guidelines in the bank buy-side debt list, and also Corey Geis, who has been the prime mover behind the list. And so what I'd like to do, Corey, with absolutely no heads-up warning on your part ahead of time, is to toss it to you to explain the genesis of this webinar, and then we will hand it over to Deborah to walk us through some of the antitrust compliance concerns that we have in talking on messaging boards with the loan group. So, Corey, how is that for giving you a heads up on?
Yeah,
on
that was all 20 seconds. I appreciate that. No, and that's fine. We've spoken about, the three of us have spoken about this in advance, so it's easy enough. But the original intention of the buy-side bank debt contact list was to help the buy-side connect with one another. Oh, I just quickly.
Did you lose your connection?
So, no. Kim Harris is saying that she cannot hear the presentation. Is there anything that she needs to do? She needs to dial in. She probably is logged into. Yeah, she needs to dial in.
What was her name?
It's Kim Harris. I think it might be her assistant, but Kim Harris is asking.
Okay.
Well,
you know what I will do is keep talking, and I will flash up on the board instructions for how to dial in.
Okay, good. So the original intention of the list was to connect fellow buy-side loan managers with one another. In the event that there was an amendment or consent that was in the market that we felt we wanted to discuss, and for whatever reason we couldn't get our hands on a lender list, or someone had to physically travel to Fargo, North Dakota to pick it up. So that was the intention, and then it became and it morphed into a bit of a forum to discuss broader issues in the market. Whether that be the disappearance of soft call protection, or the reduction from 12 months to 6 months, or the trend toward covenant light loans, which now greater than 50% of our loan market is covenant light. And what we've realized and discovered is that there clearly are sensitivities with regard to what can and cannot be discussed amongst market participants, and without potentially violating some element of the antitrust law. So so Michael and Deborah and myself have been discussing this and thought this would be a really good forum for us to initiate the discussion, have Deborah give us a bit of a download on sort of what she views as the do's and don'ts, and then launch it into a Q&A where the participants on the call can ask their questions sort of very specifically about, if we're talking about an amendment to a covenant, does that, is that a violation? If it's just deal specific, is that different than if we're talking about opposing, I don't know, the lack of soft call in a deal, and sort of these elements of what can and cannot be discussed in a public forum, and how we can use DealVector to possibly obtain our answer is really the purpose of the call.
Okay. And so when we saw some of these issues coming up, we thought we'd better call in an expert, and that's what we've done with Deb Dermody. So Deb is the co-chair of Reed Smith's Global Regulatory Enforcement Group. She was chosen as Lawyer of the Year for antitrust litigation in 2014 by Best Lawyers in America magazine, which I know we all have a subscription to. And Deborah, you've done quite a bit of work with major financial institutions as well as others. And so I wanted to hand it over to you to encourage people to, or to walk us through some of the concerns in antitrust and how that relates to messaging, and tell us what we need to know to stay out of jail. I'm also going to stress to people that we want this to be interactive, but we've also learned that very few of you will, in fact, speak up and ask a question live on the call. That's fine. So as a result, we have included Corey's email here, or you can instant message him on Bloomberg. Corey can monitor questions as they come in, and please do ask them, because this is a good chance to ask questions of the Lawyer of the Year without getting a bill, I promise. So Deb, over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Corey. And no, there will be no bill. So, and thanks everyone for joining us. I know it's already been a full day for many of you, so I appreciate you taking the time. We wanted to take, as Corey and Mike have said, just a few minutes to talk through how the antitrust laws apply to the activity that goes on the DealVector site, and how everyone who uses it can take steps to avoid and minimize that risk. I expect that most, if not all of you, have had antitrust compliance training within your own companies, and everything you learned there applies here too. It's not new or different or some corner of antitrust. This is core antitrust law. If you, as we've said, if you have questions, please go ahead and launch them during the presentation, and we can address them as they come up, and we could also do them at the end if you'd rather. So let's just charge right in here to the applicable antitrust laws. And I know you'll all be happy to know that I'm not going to talk about every antitrust law, just the one that really is causing the concern, or should cause some awareness anyway here. As you have no doubt been told many times, the United States antitrust laws are designed and intended to promote free and open competition so that parties, buyers and sellers, compete on the basis of price and quality and service. That's the overall goal. The Sherman Act, which is the principal federal antitrust law, prohibits agreements that unreasonably restrain trade. This is the anti-cartel law. Now, all commercial agreements, every single one, can be said to, air quote, restrain or restrict trade in some way. I mean, if a seller agrees to sell a product to buyer A, then therefore the seller is restrained from selling that same product to buyer B. You can only sell it to one person. So understanding that not every restraint of trade then can be illegal, it's really important, it's critical in antitrust compliance to understand what kinds of restraints or agreements are likely to be viewed as unreasonable and therefore illegal, and which ones are more likely to be viewed as reasonable and therefore on the legal side of the line. So as we look at various types of agreements, keep in mind that investors have and can have legitimate reasons to communicate. So our goal here is to identify and avoid those types of communications that can create risks without chilling the useful other communications that can go on. So let's go to the next slide, Mike. Okay. To try to
also point out we've got Corey's email and Bloomberg there at the bottom on most slides, so people can ask questions.
Right. Oh yeah, great. These are some restraints. You've seen this list before, I'm quite confident, about some restraints of trade that are always unreasonable under U.S. antitrust laws. They're viewed as, quote, per se illegal. Doesn't matter why you did it, doesn't matter what the impact is, nothing matters. If there's an agreement that does these things, then it's illegal. So it's because these agreements, when they're entered into among competitors, has to be among competitors, are always viewed under the antitrust laws as unreasonable and illegal. The courts have said we've got enough 100 years of experience. We know these things when we see them, and we know they're always unreasonable. So we're not even going to look at them. So for these purposes today, you should regard yourselves as competitors. I know you may not think of yourselves that way, but believe me, the antitrust enforcement authorities are going to do so, and so we have to do so as well. So these kinds of agreements among competitors are per se illegal, and these are the ones that are criminally prosecuted as felonies. So it includes price fixing, see here first, which is the primary antitrust no-no, right? Price fixing is broad enough to include any aspect of price, not just the core price, but discounts, fees, any aspect of price. So any agreement that fixes prices between competitors, always illegal. Similarly, customer and market allocations, that is agreeing between competitors which one will sell in a particular market or a particular geography or to a particular customer. These are also always illegal.
Deborah,
so
can I first in for a moment with a question of my own? Mike?
Please.
Now you mentioned price fixing is any aspect of the pricing. There was an article that I know I forwarded to you and Corey recently in the FT that was talking about consent fees and the idea that consent fees are only paid to people who vote yes, and it was beginning to be discussed as to whether they were high enough or whether the structure of those consent fees should only be paid to people who vote yes or to everybody who votes or just everybody in the deal. How does that jibe with what you just said about no discussion of any type of price? And
okay,
and go ahead.
Yeah, no, this really points up an important point. What's illegal under the antitrust laws are agreements about prices, right? The discussion itself is not a crime in and of itself. It is a crime when there's an agreement among or between competitors about price. So, for instance, if in those opportunities that you were talking about, the issuers were agreeing among themselves about what those fees were going to be, then that would be per se illegal. If the buyers on the buy side were entering into agreements among themselves about whether they would or would not accept them, whether they would or would not accept a deal unless it had a particular level of payment, then that could be viewed as an illegal price fixing agreement. But it is the agreement itself between the competitors that becomes illegal. Now, what we're going to see as we go on here is that in addition to avoiding the actual agreement, it's really important in antitrust compliance to avoid the appearance that you have entered into an agreement, because these kinds of agreements, these kinds of contracts, when proven, are nearly always proven by circumstantial evidence. You hardly ever write down your cartel, right? I have seen them in writing, but you hardly ever write them down. Instead, how a plaintiff or the Department of Justice later proves that price-fixing agreement exists is by circumstantial evidence. They show that the parties they say were fixing prices were together. They had opportunity. They had motive. They had communication. See, look at all of these emails back and forth. Or here, look at all the postings on the message board back and forth. You can see that they had all of this opportunity. And then you look at their conduct later, where everyone went out and wouldn't take any deal that didn't have that particular term that was just discussed. And it's a short step to prove that that conversation really represented the entering into an agreement by the parties. And so that's the real risk, that you'll create circumstantial evidence that could be used later to show that an agreement existed, when in fact it probably didn't exist. But that happens all the time. So that's how you manage the risk here.
Just to interject as well, I think the other thing you said that was very important is that the people on this call can consider themselves competitors if they are not co-investors in a particular deal. I know we're jumping ahead a little bit, but if you are in a deal and you're talking about something that is happening to the deal, that's a different kettle of fish, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and that's going to be one of the principal points I hope everyone takes away. That that controlling these risks is something that's certainly doable by everyone, but easier to do within the confines of a discussion about a particular co-investment where everyone is in that shared room together about that common investment. The level of risk is much, much lower, and the legitimacy of the conversation is much higher. So there's much less risk in that kind of circumstance than in the broader sort of industry-wide conversations that Corey was describing that had begun to crop up as the site matured.
Okay, should we?
All right, well, we'll just roll right through here then. The other points there that you saw were also per se illegal, and that's boycotts where competitors would agree that they either won't deal with a vendor or a customer, or they will only deal on certain terms, that they would agree on the terms among themselves and then go out to the common vendor or common customer and insist that they get those terms. That is illegal. And bid rigging, which will surprise no one, is also illegal, and that would be agreements among competitors about who's going to win that bid, who's going to put in a bid, who's going to sit out this one, whether you're going to bid high or low. All of that per se illegal. I'm sure all of you know that. And just to contrast that, I also wanted to show some agreements that are very much more often viewed as reasonable and legal as opposed to unreasonable. These are often agreements that are not between companies that are at the same market level, but are instead between maybe a buyer and a seller. So I think of them as vertical. They present much less antitrust risk, and I put this here really just so it would calm any questions that you might have nagging at you in the back of your mind about certain things you've seen and you're wondering if they're a problem. Exclusive dealing, where a party agrees to sell or buy from only one other party, that can be illegal where the impact is to foreclose other competitors. Otherwise, it's just a beneficial incentive. Bundling or tying products together at a lower price than individual sale price for each one of them also may be illegal if in the circumstance where the seller has a unique product or a very high market share and is effectively coercing the buyers to accept and pay for other products they don't want or they want to buy elsewhere. But outside of that circumstance, that bundle can just be a good deal for a buyer, and so you don't want to discourage all of them. Resale price maintenance is in a vertical sense, again, between a supplier and someone that resells their product, can create a lot of issues. I think they aren't really all that relevant here, so I'm not going to dwell on it unless we get a question, but I just wanted to put it here because people know about it. And the same with unilateral refusals to deal. A company can, on its own, decide who it wants to deal with its customers, with vendors. The problem and the antitrust risk comes if that company begins to agree with its competitors about who they will both deal with. That goes back to the boycott discussion we just went through. So that's the difference here. A unilateral refusal to deal is absolutely fine, but a joint or combination refusal to deal can be illegal. So let's go on to the next point. This is to refresh your recollection about how serious antitrust violations are. I know all of you know that. You may not know these numbers, but you know that it's serious. Individuals face these kinds of fines if convicted of the crime of an antitrust violation, $1 million in fine or 10 years in prison or both, and that's for each count. Corporations, $100 million in fine, or, and this is how the fines get way out of control, 2 times the monetary gain or loss from the violation. And so there's been a cartel in operation for a long period of time. The fines can run way over $100 million and do. But that's not really the end of the pain because like night follows day, the civil plaintiffs bar will bring class actions or civil cases to recover damages for parties that have been injured by antitrust violations, and they recover 3 times damages and their fees. And even when a company wins these cases, and you do from time to time, to defend an antitrust claim really imposes huge costs in fees and expert fees and in diversion of resources from the actual work of the company. So it's something to be avoided for sure. We can go on, Mike. All right.
Yeah, because I think what I really want to do is make clear that we actually have, I think, more safety on the messaging board as we've got it configured right now than we might if we were not on that board. So
I think that's right. I think that's right, the way it's grown up. So what that means for you and how we minimize risk. I mean, first, remember that as a broad group, as Mike said, you have to consider yourself as competitors and subject to the risks if you were to enter into these kinds of agreements. And this is the most acute, the risk is greatest, when you're engaged in a broad discussion across the industry group about trends or practices or particular events that you're seeing or demands that you're seeing. So that's when it is the most dangerous, the highest risk. Second, you should understand that when you are in a discussion with the common investment group, that risk really drops right down. I'm sorry, go ahead. Was there a question?
Or did you have a comment? Or did somebody have a comment?
No, that wasn't for me.
Oh, okay. Anyway, within the common investment group, where everyone in that group is an investor in that single common investment, you're co-owners of that asset, then the risks are much more modest. You have a legitimate business reason to talk to one another and about that investment and the success of the investment. So that's a much lower risk. And finally, the sort of work that could be done by DealVector itself as opposed to each of the participants in benchmarking or taking polls, that is also a very low risk activity because it would be managed by DealVector as a third party and done in such a way that all of the information would be aggregated and de-identified. And so when it would be published back to the group, having that information in that aggregated way is much safer than collecting it yourselves one-on-one. So let's go to the next slide, and we can talk about each one of these a little bit more in detail and deal with any questions that come up. The common investment groups on DealVector include, as I said, only those who have actual current investments in the asset. No one else has access to it. So because the participants are joint investors in that asset, you have a current and legitimate business interest. It's the performance and the administration of that asset, and you each share in that interest. So these discussions, when they're confined to that common asset, do not create significant antitrust risk. And I think that's a real important takeaway here. This specific common investment, though, it does not create an opportunity for the members to put up an umbrella and talk about other topics, such as broader industry-wide points or even other specific deals or opportunities. The conversation should be limited to that particular asset that the group is all invested in. So if you notice this type of discussion occurring in a common investment group, this sort of extraterritorial discussion, I'll call it, you should let DealVector know that that's going on.
I think
go ahead.
One of the important things here, I think, is that that we've discovered is we've added group messaging to DealVector to accommodate the fact that that's how messaging was taking place on the list more broadly initially. And as Corey said, the original purpose of the list was to be able to send out deal-specific messaging. One of the things we've added, however, is also the ability to filter. So not send to the entire list, but just send to those lists members who are present in a current deal. And so my understanding, Deborah, in talking to you, is that that's really going to lower the risk. So I think the implication for those on the call are that we've now got a messaging platform that's actually safer than a group email blast, and you really should have your deals loaded on the platform so that you can be a part of those common investment group conversations that are a lot safer.
Exactly.
Corey, did you have any thoughts
right
on that, especially vis-a-vis how the group started and where it's gone?
No, I think you've made the correct point. Which is having the ability on Deal Vector to specifically target other members of your the other lenders that are in the same deal as you really helps circumvent or at least prevent any potential violation of antitrust.
This I think is a really important point that I didn't learn until I was talking to Deborah, which is really the importance of using that deal filter and how that really does. When I talk to compliance managers, it definitely causes them to feel much more confident in the platform if you guys are using that feature. So I would definitely encourage all of you to have your deals on the platform and to start taking messages that way, because I think it's going to put you in a very good place vis-a-vis your compliance and your general counsel.
Exactly. And if you do have questions about how this fits with your own company's compliance program, I mean, we would encourage you to go to your company counsel and talk to them about what you've been told here and what you'd like to do, and make sure that you're comfortable and they're comfortable with it. Okay, let's go to the thornier situation, and that's sort of industry discussion groups, these wider discussions that have been going on that are not limited to that common investment. You'll recognize by now that these kinds of discussion groups create a more significant potential for a risky discussion. If you observe or participate in discussions about these risky subjects, for example, on some specific aspect of price, such discussions might be pointed out later as circumstantial evidence of an illegal agreement among those who were having that discussion to insist on that certain price or certain aspect of price as a condition of dealing with a third party, such as an issuer or an agent bank, in a later deal. So really do need to be careful here not to create an impression that you have created an agreement when you haven't created an agreement. And the same caution applies to discussions of other types of actions that I touched on, agreements to boycott an issuer or only deal on specific common terms, also would substantially raise the risk level of any discussion. The broader group can address general industry trends or developments consistent with these cautions here. So if you are uncertain at any time about the propriety of a certain topic, then I would counsel you don't raise it until you have resolved your question about it by consulting with counsel. You can't really put the genie back in the bottle, so find out and get comfortable beforehand before raising it. And let me here throw out some examples of statements that I think would be okay in a general discussion context, and some that go too far. And I'll use some examples that Corey referred to earlier. For example, and I'm going to make them simple to illustrate the point. You'll get it. The covenant light loan issue. A comment that in a general discussion I think would be okay would be for someone to say, hey, I've noticed an accelerating trend toward more covenant light agreements in the last 6 months. I think that's fine. One that goes too far, for example, would be, I'm just not going to accept any more of these covenant light deals, and I think we should all do the same to send a strong message, right? There's a big difference between stating what you've seen and stating your intention about what you're going to do about it and sort of asking others to join in. So that's the distinction I'm trying to make here. Same kind of structure thinking about the soft call period. Something that I think would be okay. I keep seeing the soft call period drop from 12 to 6 months and now down to 0. Anyone else seeing this? That, I think, would be fine. Something that I think goes over the line and is too far, again, you'll recognize the commonality. The elimination of the soft call is bad for all of us as buyers, and we should not take it anymore. So just see the dichotomy I'm trying to set up here. And finally, to turn to consent fees for amendments. For example, something I think would be okay. More and more of my deals seem to be using consent fees for positive votes on amendments. Has this always been there? Something like that, I think fine. Over the line, I've been shut out of a consent fee for the last time. They should have to pay any voter or not at all, and I'm not making any more investments with issuers that only pay for yes votes. So you should do the same thing. So I hope that makes the point in the context of some real-world examples here. What you shouldn't be doing is agreeing on specific prices or agreeing on specific terms that all of you will then turn around and insist on in your next deals. That's the problem.
Now, that having been said, we do have a bit of an answer to that, right? Because there are, legitimate forums or legitimate ways to gauge sentiment and to try to address some of these issues as an industry, group in essence.
That's exactly right. I mean, there is a way for DealVector to add a lot of value here in serving, as it is, as a third party and collecting information that then can be, as I previewed, aggregated and de-identified and then shared back so that the members and users can have a feel for how people are, what they're seeing, how they feel about an issue, what the trend is, without having directly engaged in these more dangerous conversations. A DealVector can properly pose questions to the group and can receive responsive information directly from individual members back to DealVector on a confidential basis. And at that point, DealVector can then take those responses, assemble them, aggregate them, and publish the results to the group. So no party, when they're aggregated, is going to be able to identify the responses of any other participant. And this will significantly lower the possibility that participants could use the information to compete against one another. The antitrust enforcers acknowledge this important distinction. They have published guidelines for the exchange of information among competitors in this way. And this kind of process that's being considered by DealVector would provide an opportunity to collect and share information on topical issues without generating the antitrust risk that would come from the members, the participants, just directly exchanging that same information with one another one-on-one or openly. So a survey, a benchmarking, whether it's done on a one-off or done on a regular basis, could provide a lot of useful information while really limiting the antitrust exposure.
Yeah, so the way I've interpreted for the group, the way I've interpreted the conversations I've had with Deborah and Corey up until now is that the system is used best, the DealVector system is used best for communication among members on specific deals. And in fact, we can really create a system with much, much lower risk than general communication by using the filtering based on deal. But then I also think that there is a very reasonable desire, because I've heard a number of investors tell me or use the phrase divide and conquer with respect to how they get treated in this industry. And I think that there is a very reasonable desire and really right for investors to be able to gauge sentiment and ensure that the playing field is leveled vis-a-vis sell side. And but what I've learned in our conversations is that can be very difficult to do at an issue level on a group messaging forum. So I think the solution to those kinds of questions is for us to come up with a quarterly benchmark. And I guess what I'd really like to hear from the group and probably you won't pick up the phone and say it right now on the call, but please feel free to send Corey a message or contact us afterwards, is, does this strike you as a good idea to have some kind of quarterly benchmark or quarterly survey where we can solicit input from you all as buy-side investors on questions that you really submit, and we run, and then we can publish. And my understanding is we can publish them back to the group, and we can publish them to the sell side as well, right? I mean, this can be a widely distributed document that says this is the sentiment of the industry. Is that accurate, Deborah?
Yeah, I mean, you and I will talk about, offline the specific guidelines that I've just mentioned that the agencies have developed so that you can be sure that you've followed them appropriately. But then, yes, you can share it.
So it would be possible to say that, 70% of buy-side buyers really dislike really feel that consent fees have gotten too low. And it's causing them to consider their level of investment in the category. That's different from somebody within the group advocating for boycotting.
Right. It's not advocacy at all. It's description of the current situation.
Okay.
I mean, it is sort of backdoor advocacy, I guess.
Well, I'm hopeful that's one of the things that Deal Vector again can bring to the group as a value add, and I really do want to hear from group members, since I do think that there are legitimate issues that you all want to discuss that are not necessarily germane to a particular loan, which you can definitely do on Deal Vector, and we definitely want to hear from you about what you would want to be surveyed on. Corey, are there any questions that are coming in? I'm not hearing a lot of breaking in from you.
Yeah, I don't have any questions on IB or by email, but obviously, everyone is encouraged to either send me an IB or an email, or feel free to ask a question here on the call. But I haven't seen anything yet.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, it's a touchy subject. I recognize that people may.
Yeah, you've made everyone paranoid with the
everyone paranoid.
The criminal implication slide.
I know.
I know. When I do training in person, I find that a lot of people don't ask me any questions until their bosses leave the room. So I completely get it.
Okay. Well, we can talk about Tom Brady and deflate next, or something that's more safe. Well, let's go ahead and move on.
Yeah, this is really just a wrap up of what the particular takeaways that I'm hoping everybody will take with them today. None of this should be a surprise at this point. First, you should participate in those common investment group discussions for those deals and only for those deals where you have the current investment, and then stick to that single subject matter. Second, in the general discussion groups, avoid the comments or exchanges that could in any way suggest an agreement among the group or commitment to common action with respect to the industry itself. And third, discussions in the general groups that in any way relate to prices are going to present the highest level of risk for all of you, and should be avoided. And finally, to harken back to the benchmarking point, Deal Vector's ability to conduct that benchmarking project for the participants can offer a low-risk approach to generating really useful industry-wide information. So that's all I prepared, because I think that really summarizes what the risk that we see and the way we see to manage it and to control it for everyone.
All right. So we just asked if there were questions. I recognize you all have just seen a slide saying you face jail time if you ask a question, so you probably won't ask the question. It's not that you're taking away from it, but the message I take away from it is that, again, I think that with the deal filtering function, we've got a really safe way for you all to communicate on things that are very legitimate for you as co-investors in deals to protect your interests. And then for the broader topics of conversation, I really want to hear from all of you about, or Corey, and you can get to Corey about what we can do to surface these issues that really are significant areas of concern and legitimate areas of concern for buy-side investors, and how do we get that message out and that word out and gauge sentiment in a way that keeps us all safe. So with that being it, unless there are any final questions, I think we can wrap up.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about it.
Thanks, Deborah.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and I hope we get to meet in person at some point.
All right.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, then.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.